Brought to you by CGTN Europe.
I'm Stephen Cole. Welcome to the Agenda podcast. 2020 will go down as one of the most extraordinary years on record. The COVID-19 pandemic, as unexpected as it was, all-encompassing, changed all our lives, perhaps forever. So what does 2021 have in store? On this special programme, we'll hear the views of some of the world's top experts, and we'll start where else? With the big one, the global economy. I spoke to the former head of Goldman Sachs Asset Management, Lord Jim O'Neill, and asked whether he was expecting a bounce back in 2021.
There are obviously enormous uncertainties related to the ongoing developments with this virus, particularly in Western Europe and the Americas. But yes, I do. I expect a significant bounce back because of the discovery and rollout of vaccines.
And which industries do you think could possibly lead that bounce back, that recovery?
I think that's a very interesting question because it might start to change from what we saw in the second half of 2020. If the vaccine rollout is successful, and I emphasize if, then actually the sectors that have suffered the most from COVID-19, particularly travel and tourism, by the second half of this year might actually be booming. And you can see some signs of hope about that in the way some stock market prices are behaving, both absolutely and relative to each other, but also in linked to that, the way some advanced bookings are being conducted by optimistic consumers in many parts of the world.
And where do you think we'll be in terms of global GDP by this time next year?
I think, again, with the caveat, a lot depends on what happens with these vaccines, as well as, of course, the variants of the virus that we're currently experiencing. I think we're going to see a very strong period of economic activity in 2021, particularly in the second half, but maybe starting as early as the spring, and in some parts of the world, particularly Asia, led by China, already now. And I think we will have at least recovered most of what we lost in 2020. And on at least when the history books show data for this period, 2021 will appear as one of the strongest years for economic growth ever, although, of course, it will be coming on the back of one of the worst ones in 2020.
The World Bank's China Economic Update predicts growth of just short of 8% for 2021. Well, here to tell us more is Dr. Li Wei, Director of China Economy at Cheung Graduate School of Business. Li Wei, is 8% growth, is that achievable? Is that a realistic target?
Based on the data we've seen so far, 8% looks pretty much on target. And I think with the Chinese economy going on full steam, with the COVID-19 under control, and I think it looks pretty good so far.
That's a very rapid bounce back, and a figure, 8%, the West can only dream of. Would you single out any one particular sector which is driving growth in China in 2021?
Right. Well, in fact, as we see from the data, it's quite broad-based. I think one of the things we see in the West is that consumption in some sector has gone up, in particular with e-commerce. But any consumption related to close contact had a huge impact, right? But in China, since COVID-19 is under control, we largely have the restaurants full again. I was trying to book a restaurant last night, and I couldn't do it, right? Because I did it a few hours later, and I tried to book the same restaurant tonight, and I wasn't able to do it again. So it is getting very much back to normal and in China, and it's still not fully normal. That's one of the reasons why for the coming new year and 2021, things look even better. And I think if the presumption is that China is still going to have COVID-19 under control. So broadly, I think the Chinese economy is forecasted to do well if the rest of the world comes online with a rapid deployment of the vaccines in many countries. And I think the main story for this coming year is how quickly can we get the vaccines distributed and inoculated and so on and so forth, and have those things, have many economies coming online simultaneously.
The World Health Organization has rarely, if ever, dominated the headlines as much as it did in 2020. In charge of the global response to the COVID-19 pandemic, its role in bringing the world back to a new normal has never been more vital to the future of a healthy planet. So what exactly is 2021 likely to bring for the World Health Organization? Well, with me now is WHO spokesperson Dr. Margaret Harris. Dr. Harris, what is the WHO expecting from 2021?
We're expecting that all that we've learned this year, all that we've learned from the science, but also about working together, achieving solidarity, will bring us the tools to stand up, fight, and beat this virus in 2021. Some of that will be vaccination, but it will also be the testing, and it will also be the social behaviors that we've learned work. We do it all together, we will see the end of this pandemic.
And what will the role be of the WHO in rolling out the vaccines?
Well, indeed, it will be a huge role. So way back at the beginning of this pandemic, we set up something called the ACT Accelerator. And one part of that is a vaccine delivery system called COVAX. And the aim of that is to get vaccine to every country in the world. We've already prioritized the populations that need to be vaccinated first. That's healthcare workers and people who are most vulnerable to getting very sick and dying from the disease, older people and people with underlying illness. Now, we calculated that that's 20% of the population in every country. So it's a very big job. But we've got the commitment of countries representing more than 80%, 90% of the population of the world. And so we know we can do it.
What do you think you've learned from the extraordinary events of 2020? And how will what you have learned change the way you operate in 2021-22?
We've learned that preparedness is key. Really learning from previous outbreaks, previous experiences, and not just learning, but applying those lessons. We've seen that in the countries that have been able to bring down or control the transmission of this virus without having to resort to anything beyond strong public health measures. And also what's key is having a strong health system that everyone has access to, universal health coverage, and an excellent primary healthcare system so that people can get care just down the road from trusted people. Where that is functioning well, countries' populations have done better with this pandemic. But of course, we all need to do better and really strengthen those things in 2021.
The next 12 months could define the future of our planet. In October, COP26, the UN's delayed climate change conference, will take place in Glasgow in Scotland. And before that, in May, delegates will gather in Kunming in China for COP15, the Convention on Biological Diversity. Elizabeth Maruma Mrema is the person in charge of COP15. And when I spoke to her last year, she seemed optimistic that real progress could be made in 2021.
Clearly now we see particularly different stakeholders coming on board, ready to take action. We've seen also businesses on their own signing their own pledges for action, because studies have also told us $44 trillion are moderately or highly dependent on nature. And if $44 trillion are dependent on nature, and that is $10 trillion per year, it's basically the business. There's a business case here, and the business has an interest to take action if they have to continue to operate. The indigenous peoples and local communities who have been the custodians of biodiversity and nature, the traditional knowledge, and this is where there are lessons for conservation of biodiversity, ready to act and share those best practices.
And
I have to be optimistic with all this.
But do others share her apparent optimism? Let's hear from Manuel Pulgar-Vidal, former Peruvian environment minister and now climate and energy global practice leader at the Worldwide Fund for Nature, and Tasneem Essop, executive director of Climate Action Network.
We are closing this complex 2020 in a very good way. I think that we have gotten 5 aces. A very good nation pledge of almost 80 leaders around the world, the USA elections. Also, we have had the announcement of China for a strong NDC. Also, we are talking about recovery. And the 12 summit and the race to zero. So this closing of 2020 is bringing to us a strong momentum. So now we are entering into 2021, in which, let me use some word, Stephen, convergence. It is the time in which we will not only address and achieve good things on climate and, on the other hand, on nature, but we will start to converge. We will start to talk each to other. And in that sense, it's going to be a strong time and a strong 2021 that it is going to bring to us not only good outcome, but a new impulse for both processes, the climate one and the nature one.
So, Manuel, if all the voices are singing in harmony, what are the key agreements you'd like to see reached in 2021?
Look, 2 things. Intangible things, I hope that Glasgow can not only achieve and address regular tasks, so Article 6, finance, adaptation, and all those kind of things, but also can send clarity around the process for the future. So if we can get something that it could be called the Glasgow platform to accelerate implementation, that would be fantastic. That is the tangible. But in the non-tangible, what we do need it is to send a strong signal to citizens that this process, it is irreversible and unstoppable. That is key, because we do need to re-engage with citizens about the feasibility of this process and the possibility that we can really achieve success by 2030 and by 2050. So tangible and non-tangible in my point of view, Stephen.
And lastly, Manuel, if you do reach the agreements you want, how can you make sure they're implemented?
Look, we are in a really interesting time. And my short answer to your question, it is domestically. We got the agreement globally, but the implementation, it is a domestic task. And the only way to do that, it is by pushing each one of the almost 200 governments of the world, not only to have a clear and already enhanced NDC, but also a clear vision towards a net zero 2050. And to do that, we do need to recreate what we have done in the global process by engaging domestically state and non-state actors that include business, academia, subnational government, indigenous people, citizens itself. If we are able to do that domestically, implementation, it is going to be more easy.
Let's get another view now on the prospects for the planet in 2021. Joining me from Cape Town is Tasneem Essop, Executive Director of Climate Action Network. Tasneem, you must hope for more environmental change in 2021, especially with the 2 big environmental conferences happening this year.
What's important for 2021 really pulls out the key lessons that we learned in 2020. And so while, of course, the environmental focus is going to be seriously important, we need to recognize that the key lesson that we learned out of 2020 was the fact that, the pandemic, the health pandemic, and the climate impacts that we experienced during 2020 had the same impacted communities across the world. So those who would hit the hardest were those who were living in poverty, those most vulnerable on the front lines were the frontline health workers, frontline communities living on the front lines of climate impacts. And they are the same communities, the same people. And so the big issue, I think, for 2021, when it comes to environmental issues, is to make the links between those vulnerabilities. We do need to look at going beyond the current obligations, because we have to look at the funding, in the long-term funding, and that will be discussed, in fact, at the Glasgow COP. And so they have to come ready with those commitments as well. So fulfill your existing commitments to 2020, as well as looking at the kinds of commitments you will put on the table for post-2020 period as well.
And the ultimate hope for both of us, and I'm sure many others as well, is that by this time next year, the world will be a greener place.
Well, I hope that by this time next year, the world will be a greener place, a healthy place, a more just place, a more equitable place. And that can only happen when we have international solidarity, when rich nations recognize that they have to support and stand in solidarity with poorer nations, both in terms of the health pandemic and, we've already seen what's happening with the access to the vaccine and, again, the kind of inequity that exists around that, very similar to the kinds of solutions that we need to address climate impacts and the access and the equity around that. So my hope is that next year, this time, more politicians, but more importantly, people across the world recognize that we have to address the climate crisis with urgency, but also all these multiple crises are connected and we have to look at it holistically.
There were few industries that were hit harder in 2020 than aviation. Passenger demand fell by more than half. Hundreds of billions of dollars of revenue were lost, and tens of thousands of jobs disappeared across the industry. But is there now some light on the horizon for 2021? Here's the view of the Director General and CEO of the International Air Transport Association, Alexandre de Juniac, and Senior Travel Editor of the independent newspaper, Simon Calder.
The good news, as everyone knows, is the arrival of the vaccine. Well, the vaccine should, start by the beginning of 2021, but should be available on a large scale, not before mid-2021. So it means that at this date, and it's our central hypothesis, we would normally see borders being significantly and reopened all over the world. What we are advocating for is for states not to wait for that date, but to reopen their borders to allow the air traffic to restart. And we are proposing that not a simple removal of the travel restriction, but a replacement by a systematic testing.
What can you say to people to persuade them to go back in the air again?
We are not worried about the appetite to fly. When we look at domestic market in countries that have successfully fought against COVID-19, and China is probably the best example, on the Chinese domestic market, the level of traffic is at the same figure as 2019. So massively, Chinese passengers have come back on Chinese airline flights on the Chinese domestic market. It is also a situation, not at this level, but that we see in the US domestic market that has dropped, but not as much as the international market. So the appetite is there. The point is that governments are closing their borders, either by closing purely and simply the borders, or by putting travel restrictions, and particularly quarantine measures that are a major deterrent for passengers to come. We estimate that when there is a risk of quarantine en route, either at the destination or at the country of origin, the impact on the bookings is simply minus 100%.
Now let's ask Simon Calder, Senior Travel Editor at the independent newspaper. Simon, what are your predictions for the travel and tourism industry in 2021?
I'm predicting very, very quiet January, February, and then sometime from the middle of March to the end of April, we are going to see a really strong blossoming of travel, or at least opening up of nations which are very tourism dependent, saying, look, yes, we know that opening up is bringing a risk to our population, but frankly, our economy desperately needs it. Hundreds of thousands of our citizens rely on tourism. But if you take East Asia, Vietnam, Thailand, Australia, New Zealand, looking to Australasia, they have done incredibly well. They are not in the mood for inviting, for example, Brits to come over and just holiday like they did before, because, well, frankly, they believe that we pose a significant threat.
One of the biggest and fastest growing sectors in the travel business is the cruise industry. Is that finished for 2021, perhaps starting again 2022?
No part of the travel industry has suffered as badly as cruising has done. Unquestionably, it has been well, everything about it. The typical cruise might take in 10 different countries. If they're all imposing different rules, that makes it very, very difficult. So this part of the travel industry, which for decades has seemed completely impervious to anything, now under severe threat. And I think we're going to see, as we have done with aviation, the retirement of lots and lots of older, less efficient assets, which effectively means reducing capacity, sadly reducing employment and reducing opportunities for people who still want to go cruising.
2020 was a terrible year for sport, with everything from the Olympic Games to the European Football Championships postponed. Both are due to take place in 2021, but will fans be able to be there? Let's speak now to double Olympic gold medalist and president of World Athletics, Lord Sebastian Coe. Seb, will the Olympics go ahead, first of all?
Yes, I'm pretty sure they will. Look, these are particularly uncertain times, and again, if we'd been talking about this a few weeks ago, then I think we could have been absolutely certain. But I'm still pretty sure that every attempt will be made to get them off and running. I took a small delegation from World Athletics just a few weeks ago to Tokyo. Our technical teams that looked at our road courses up in Sapporo as well. And I met everybody really from the president of the organizing committee through to all the venue managers and the municipal authorities in Tokyo, the governor of Tokyo. And there is a cast iron determination to get these games off. I think we recognize they're going to be different, and they're going to be different for the athletes. If you just imagine 10,500 competitors alone and probably another 6,000 or 7,000 admin staff on top of that in the village, that in itself is a huge challenge around feeding times and around call rooms and protocols before competitions and social distancing. And that's just one sliver of it. But look, I wake up pretty much most mornings grateful that it is Japan that's dealing with this and not some other countries, because there is a fortitude, there's a resilience, and there's a capacity and a competency in Japan and a real fortitude to do this.
And an Olympic Games with or without spectators?
Well, I obviously hope with spectators. The spirit of the Games is in large part determined by passionate fans, and you want every athlete in that stadium, as we had in London, to feel that they were competing in front of a home crowd. We achieved that in London because, of course, London has such a rich community mix. But look, if the situation determines that we have to either have a stadium without fans or a stadium with limited numbers, I think the athletes themselves are now at that point where, frankly, they'd probably take anything. They've had a year of little or no competition, although in World Athletics we did manage to get a pretty good season up and running and some outstanding performances at the end of the year. But look, athletes don't wake up each morning to train, however complicated the surroundings are, and particularly around COVID. They wake up to train to become world-class athletes, and there is no bigger platform than the Olympic Games. So they're pretty keen to get there under pretty much most circumstances.
Double Olympic gold medalist Sebastian Coe there. And finally, we couldn't have a forecasting show without looking to the stars to see what they have in store for us. 2020 certainly wasn't what we'd been expecting, and nobody is sure what's going to happen in 2021, except perhaps astrologer Susan Miller. And Susan joins me now from New York. Susan, lots of planetary activity. Does that augur well for 21?
Saturn and Uranus are clashing. Saturn rules all things that must be preserved from the past. Landmark buildings, Buckingham Palace, old beautiful letters from George Washington or the Queen, estate jewelry. Uranus wants to bulldoze everything and create new and innovative. Now, some things will be obvious. Oh, we need to keep this, and we need to change this. But it's that gray area that all year, these two planets will be banging and clanging and thumping around the heavens, and they're birth pangs for a new way of life. We are walking over a bridge to a completely new lifestyle. I don't think a lot of us will be going back to work the way we used to, and that'll be good for women, because it's hard when your babysitter doesn't come and, you know, your life falls apart. So that will be easier and less commuting. We will be getting together again, but I don't think companies will need to see you every single day.
Can I ask you, Susan, sort of if you can summarize 2021 in a paragraph for us?
Well, it's rebuilding, and there's a public forum. We're going to decide what stays, what goes. We don't have to go back to our old life, and I don't think that's even a possibility. We will create a new life that's more fitting with the technology we have now and what we want to do with our time. Technology helps us be more and more and more productive in less and less time, Moore's Law. And with Uranus so strong, also, the planets are moving into Aquarius. Aquarius is a sign of groups working together. They don't care who gets the credit, and they're saying the reason the vaccine came out so fast is nobody cared who got the credit. We had an emergency, and the U.S. was working with England, with Germany. You know, people were working in teams, and you're going to see a lot of that in the future. And people will not rely on the government for stimulus. It will be more philanthropy and people helping people on any scale that they can, because Aquarius is very humanitarian.
Susan Miller, astrologer from New York, thank you so much for telling us what is going to come in 2021. That brings us to the end of another edition of the Agenda podcast. And do join me again every week to see whether any of those predictions come true. Next week, though, we'll be having more food for thought, as I'll be looking at the growing cost of the global obesity crisis. Remember, you can subscribe to this podcast on iTunes, Stitcher and Spotify. You can also find us on CGTN Europe, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram and YouTube.
The most interesting questions.
Are there other living beings beyond Earth?
Will man or machine be in charge?
Great question.
Always have more than one answer.
Well, hold on, let me just draw up a list.
And always come from more than one person.
That's where the credibility lies.
The concept of having a machinery which is alive and evolving didn't wait for us.
The end of inequality of incomes and wealth around the world, can you imagine how difficult that is at the moment to achieve?
Every episode, Stephen Cole, Murray Beveridge, and some of the brightest minds out there shed light on the answers to some of the most intriguing questions.
There are two ways of looking at this.
Machines can't really discriminate between civilian and military targets.
The Answers Project.
Maybe we need to just look at this in a bit more detail.
Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence.
The Answers Project, a new podcast from CGTN Europe.